Sometimes the biggest souls live in bodies the world refuses to see. In the cold hills of Montana, where the autumn wind carves faces and shatters certainties, a giantess searched for her place among mortals. Tilda Grayson stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, but it was her heart that defied all measure. The November wind swept through Willow Bend with a stubbornness that seemed to want to snatch away even the most tenacious memories. On the saloon's bulletin board, tucked between wanted posters and cattle auction notices, a small yellowed paper fluttered in the gusts. The ink had smeared a bit, but the words were still readable. Honest farmer seeks companion. Simple life. Quiet nights. Must appreciate the countryside. Tilda Grayson stopped in front of that notice as if it were a distorting mirror. Her immense hands, nails bitten down from years of forced labor, trembled slightly as she touched the paper. She had never imagined that one day she might answer an ad like this, that a man could look for a companion without specifying height, beauty, or age. Around her, the residents of Willow Bend went about their Saturday morning business. Women in thick wool dresses chatted outside the general store, their voices carried on the cold wind. Men loaded their wagons with supplies, their hats pulled down low over their eyes to guard against the squalls. No one looked directly at her, but Tilda felt their furtive glances, quick peeks followed by whispers. She had left her father's traveling circus 3 months earlier, when the storm had destroyed the big top and freed all the sideshow attractions from their gilded cage. 3 months of wandering from town to town, sleeping in abandoned barns, eating whatever she could find, searching for a place where her size wouldn't be a spectacle anymore. The wind picked up, tearing the notice from the rusty nail for good. Tilda caught it mid-air, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her too small coat pocket. For the first time in years, she felt something akin to hope warm her chest. Destination: Amos Klein's farm. Amos Klein's farm stood 3 miles from Willow Bend, nestled between 2 hills like a well-kept secret. The dirt road snaked through fields now bare, where only a few forgotten corn cobs testified to the recent harvest. The wind continued its wild dance, rattling the wooden shutters and whistling through the loose planks of the barn. Amos was in his vegetable garden pulling the last carrots of the season. His movements were precise, methodical, like everything he'd done since his mother's death 2 years prior. At 38, he had learned to live in silence, to rely only on his own hands and his own determination. His mother had taught him that emotion was a luxury farmers couldn't afford. He looked up when he heard footsteps on the gravel. What he saw froze him in his tracks. An immense woman stood at the entrance to his property, her auburn hair whipped by the wind, her too small coat revealing strong wrists and hands that had known hard work. She looked nothing like what he'd imagined when he wrote his ad. He had thought of a delicate widow, maybe a school marm tired of city life, someone who would appreciate the quiet of his farm and be content to keep his house. Tilda stopped a few feet from him, feeling his gaze cut through the surprise to something more complex. It wasn't fear she read in his green eyes, nor the disgust she had grown used to. It was distrust, tinged with a vulnerability she hadn't expected to find in a man. "You posted an ad," she said simply, her deep voice carried on the wind. "My name is Tilda Grayson." Amos propped his spade against the fence and wiped his hands on his canvas apron. He was tall for a man, but she towered over him by half a head. Yet, it wasn't her size that troubled him most. It was the way she stood, straight despite the wind, as if nothing in the world could make her bend. "Amos Klein," he replied after a long silence. I wasn't expecting someone like me," Tilda finished with a smile devoid of bitterness. "That's often the case." The wind picked up again, driving dead leaves between them like an autumn curtain. Amos observed this woman who didn't lower her eyes, who didn't apologize for existing, and something in him awoke. A curiosity he'd thought buried with his mother. In Amos's kitchen, a wrought iron teapot sat enthroned at the center of the rough wooden table, its polished sides reflecting the dim light from the window. This teapot had belonged to his grandmother, then his mother, and now it seemed to wait patiently for another woman to give it meaning. The wind rattled the window panes, creating a familiar melody Amos knew by heart. Tilda sat on the chair he indicated, her knees brushing the underside of the table. Everything in this house seemed to have been designed for normal-sized people. and she constantly had to adjust her position to avoid breaking anything. But Amos didn't seem to mind. He poured the tea with deliberate movements, as if he hosted visitors of her stature every day. "Where are you from?" he asked, pushing a steaming cup toward her. Tilda wrapped her hands around the warm porcelain. "Everywhere and nowhere. I traveled with a circus for 20 years. My father—" She paused, searching for the right words. "My father owned the show." Amos didn't flinch, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. Understanding, perhaps. Or pity, which she hated even more. "And you decided to leave." "The storm decided for me," she corrected. "But yes, I seized the opportunity." Silence settled between them, punctuated only by the wind continuing its show against the walls. Amos drank his tea in small sips, observing this woman who filled his space without crowding it. There was something peaceful about her, despite her imposing size. Something that contrasted with the memories he held of his mother. Always agitated, always discontent with something. "Why did you answer my ad?" he finally asked. Tilda set down her cup and looked him straight in the eyes. "Because you didn't write Pretty Woman Wanted or Delicate Lady Desired. You wrote Must Appreciate the Countryside. I know how to appreciate the countryside. I also know how to work hard, take care of animals, and I never complain about the silence." Amos nodded slowly. He had spent so many years listening to his mother complain about everything, the weather, the neighbors, life itself, that the idea of a woman who appreciated silence seemed almost miraculous to him. "Can you cook?" he asked, almost timidly. "Enough not to starve. You?" For the first time since she arrived, Amos cracked a smile. "Same here." Outside, the wind began to subside, as if it had accomplished its mission by bringing this strange woman to his door. The teapot, a silent witness to their first conversation, seemed to shine a little brighter in the fading afternoon light. Tilda's first days on the farm unfolded into a strange and soothing routine. Amos had set up a room for her in the attic, the only space high enough for her to stand without stooping. The night wind was more present there, whistling through the tiles, but Tilda found the sound comforting. She had spent so many years hearing the shouts of the crowd and the roars of wild animals that she had almost forgotten the beauty of natural sounds. Every morning she came down before dawn to find Amos already awake, preparing coffee in the teapot. They didn't talk much, but their movements began to synchronize. He got out the cups, she poured the milk. He cut the bread, she prepared the jams. A silent choreography that surprised Amos with its simplicity. That morning, as she headed to the barn to feed the cows, Tilda noticed Amos watching her, not with wariness but with growing curiosity. When she effortlessly lifted a bale of hay that he himself struggled to carry, she heard him let out a small, admiring whistle. "You could help me fix the pasture fence," he said spontaneously. "I'm having trouble with the posts." Tilda turned to him, surprised. It was the first time he had asked her for something, openly acknowledging that he needed her help. "Of course," she replied simply. They worked side by side for hours, Tilda holding the beams while Amos fastened them. The autumn wind continued its dance around them, but it seemed less biting, less hostile. Sometimes their hands brushed as they reached for the same tool and neither pulled away. "Your mother, did she love this farm?" Tilda asked, pointing to the house with her chin. Amos stopped hammering and looked toward the family homestead. "My mother didn't love anything," he said after a long silence. "She always found something wrong. The land too hard, the winters too long, the neighbors too distant. Even me, I was disappointing." Tilda felt something tighten in her chest. Disappointing how? Not ambitious enough, too quiet, too soft, she'd say. She wanted me to leave the farm to go to town and make my fortune. She didn't understand that here, I was home. The hammer slipped in Amos's hand, and Tilda caught it before it fell. Their fingers touched, and this time neither of them moved. "I understand," she said softly. "I was always told I was too big, too strong, too different. But here, with you, I feel like I'm just me." The wind seemed to approve their words, gently caressing the remaining leaves on the trees. News of Tilda's presence at Amos's farm spread through Willow Bend faster than the autumn wind carried dead leaves. At the general store, tongues wagged. Mrs. Henderson, the postmistress, swore she'd seen her carry a sack of grain that would have broken a normal man's back. Mr. Bailey, the blacksmith, swore she was at least 8 feet tall, maybe 10. That creature will end up crushing him in his bed, Mrs. Prescott whispered to her neighbor outside the church. Poor Amos doesn't realize the danger. But the gossip didn't reach the farm, protected by its hills and isolation. Tilda and Amos lived in their bubble of shared work and knowing silences. She had fallen into the habit of preparing dinner while he finished his chores, and every evening they gathered around the old table, the steaming teapot between them like a silver bridge. That evening, Amos watched Tilda cut the bread with a precision that betrayed years of practice. Her movements were economical, calculated, as if she'd long learned to waste nothing. At the circus, she said suddenly, we ate after everyone else. The sideshow attractions always went last. I learned to make every bite last. Amos put down his fork. What was it like, being put on display? Tilda looked up at him, surprised by the delicacy of his question. Most people asked her how much she weighed or if she was born that big. Dehumanizing, she replied simply. My father made me stand on a platform. People paid to stare at me like a curious animal. They shouted things. Sometimes they threw objects. I'd learned to feel nothing anymore. And now? Tilda looked around at the rough wooden walls, at the golden glow of the oil lamp, at this man who was truly listening to her. Now, I feel everything. The taste of bread I made myself. The warmth of the fire we lit together. The wind that no longer chases me but cradles me. Amos reached out to her, hesitated, then gently placed his hand on hers. For the first time in years, Tilda didn't flinch at a man's touch. You're not a spectacle anymore, he said. You're home. Outside, the night wind whispered against the shutters. But inside, in the warm kitchen light, 2 wounded souls discovered they could heal together. The teapot, a silent witness to this rebirth, seemed to hold more than tea. It held hope. The Willow Bend Harvest Fair was the most anticipated event of the year. Farmers from the surrounding areas came to show off their finest produce. Artisans set up their stalls, and families gathered to celebrate the end of the harvest. This year, the event took on a special dimension. Everyone wanted to see Amos Klein's giantess. Tilda had initially refused to go. The idea of becoming a spectacle again, even unintentionally, terrified her. But Amos had insisted with a stubborn gentleness. We'll go together, he had said, refilling the teapot for their morning tea. You have nothing left to prove to anyone, but you also have nothing left to hide. When they arrived in the main square, a strange silence fell over the crowd. Tilda walked beside Amos, straight and dignified, wearing a blue dress she had sewn herself. The wind played in her auburn hair, and for the first time in years, she didn't lower her eyes. Whispers quickly resumed, but Amos didn't let go of her arm. They walked to the vegetable stall he had prepared, his finest gourds and roundest apples carefully arranged. Tilda helped him put up the tarp against the wind that threatened to knock everything over. Look at that strength, someone muttered behind them. Not natural for a woman, another added. But all comments died when a piercing scream tore through the air. At the end of the main street, a wagon was careening down the slope driverless, pulled by 2 panicked horses. Inside, 2 children clung to the sideboards, their screams of terror carried on the wind. The wagon headed straight for the ravine bordering town. The men present froze, calculating the distance, assessing their chances. Some ran, but they were too far, too slow. Tilda didn't think twice. She abandoned Amos's stall and launched into a wild run, her long legs devouring the distance with surprising ease. The wind that had been her faithful companion seemed to carry her, quickening her stride. She caught up with the wagon just before the fatal turn. With a powerful leap, she grabbed the bridle of the first horse, her feet digging furrows in the damp earth. The muscles in her arms tensed. Her hands scraped on the rough leather, but she held on tight. The wagon slowed, swayed dangerously, then came to a halt mere feet from the precipice. When silence fell again, broken only by the relieved sobs of the children, Tilda still stood, the reins in her hands, blood flowing from her palms. Around her the crowd had gathered, but this time, it wasn't to judge her anymore. It was to admire her. Amos ran to her, his face reflecting a pride he no longer sought to hide. "Tilda," he whispered, taking her wounded hands. My God, Tilda. For the first time in her life, she was a spectacle she had chosen to be. The days following the fair incident transformed Tilda's life in a way she'd never imagined. Sheriff Morrison organized an impromptu ceremony in the church square, where the entire community gathered despite the persistent wind that made the banners snap. Tilda stood facing the crowd, Amos by her side, holding the family teapot he'd insisted on bringing, a symbolic gesture to show she was now part of his legacy. For the first time in decades, the gazes upon her expressed respect rather than morbid curiosity. "Miss Grayson," the sheriff solemnly declared, "on behalf of the Willow Bend community and the Miller families, I present you with this medal for your exemplary courage." When the bronze medal touched her chest, Tilda felt something break within her. Not her resistance, but the invisible chains she'd worn since childhood. The applause that erupted was carried by the autumn wind like a promise of renewal. The traveling photographer immortalized the scene. Tilda standing tall and proud, the medal shining on her blue dress, Amos smiling by her side. This image would appear in the local newspaper and be broadcast by radio stations in neighboring counties. For the first time, the name Tilda Grayson would not be associated with the sideshow, but with heroism. If you appreciate this story of courage and transformation, don't hesitate to subscribe to our channel to discover the rest of this moving tale. How will Tilda handle this newfound fame? And what secret from her past threatens to resurface? But that evening, returning to the farm, Tilda discovered an envelope slipped under the door. The handwriting was familiar, penned by a hand she'd learned to dread. Inside, just a few words, but they were enough to make her strong hands tremble. "You owe me your life, and you belong to me, Dad." Amos, who was preparing tea in the kitchen, immediately noticed her change in demeanor. She had gone white as a sheet, the letter trembling between her fingers. "What is it?" he asked, approaching her. "He found me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that began to blow violently again. "My father. He knows where I am." The teapot Amos held slipped from his hands and shattered on the kitchen floor, spilling hot tea and silver fragments across the room. The symbol of their nascent happiness lay in pieces, like an omen of trials to come. The weeks following the letter were marked by a tension that even Montana's relentless wind seemed to carry in its gusts. Tilda jumped at the slightest sound, scanned the horizon from the kitchen window, and her nights were filled with nightmares where she heard her father's voice echoing under the big top. Amos had gathered the pieces of the broken teapot with meticulous care, storing them in a wooden box as if he hoped to one day glue them back together. But they now drank their morning tea from mismatched cups, and the ritual had lost its magic. One icy December morning, as Tilda fed the chickens in the yard, she spotted an unfamiliar silhouette coming up the dirt path. A man in a dark suit, too well dressed to be a farmer, walked with measured steps toward the house. His affable face and polite smile didn't fool Tilda for a second. "Mr. Klein," the stranger called out, tipping his hat. "Allow me to introduce myself. Jeremiah Polk, reporter for the Helena Tribune. I heard about Miss Grayson's heroic deed and would like to write an article about this remarkable story." Amos emerged from the barn, wary. He had learned to recognize liars. His mother had given him enough examples. This man smelled phony a mile away. "We have nothing to say to newspapers," Amos replied firmly. But Polk insisted, asking questions about the medal, about Tilda's origins, about her past. His questions were too precise, too pointed. When he mentioned traveling shows and sideshow attractions, Tilda understood he already knew everything. "You know my father," she said simply. Polk's polite mask slipped slightly. "Mr. Grayson is indeed concerned about his daughter's well-being. He asked me to check that you were doing all right. Tell my father I'm never coming back." "Oh, but it's not that simple," Polk retorted, his tone hardening. "There are matters of compensation, years of investment, unfulfilled contracts." The wind suddenly picked up, rattling the shutters and kicking up dust around them. Amos stepped closer to Tilda, instinctively protective. "Get off my property," he said in a voice he didn't recognize, firm and threatening. Polk recoiled, but his smile returned. Of course, but think about it, Miss Grayson. Your father can be very persuasive when he wants to be, and this little town seems so peaceful. It would be a shame if it were to become troubled." When the man left, Tilda collapsed on the house steps, her hands shaking violently. For the first time in months, she felt like the hunted creature she once was again. Silas Grayson arrived in Willow Bend on a January morning, where the icy wind turned every breath into a cloud of vapor. He no longer resembled the flamboyant ringmaster Tilda had known. Dressed in a worn morning suit and an overcoat too large for his stooped frame, he carried official documents in a cracked leather satchel and wore the expression of a man eaten away by bitterness. He first introduced himself to Sheriff Morrison, then at the general store, telling anyone who would listen the story of an ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her sick father after years of sacrifice. He had perfected his tale. Tilda was his only support, his pride and joy, and her disappearance had financially and emotionally ruined him. I invested my entire fortune in her education, her costumes, her training, he explained to the townspeople gathered outside the church, his eyes wet with calculated tears. When the circus burned, God forgive me for that tragedy, she left without a word, leaving me with debts and grief. Tongue started wagging again. Mrs. Prescott, who had never taken kindly to the idea of a giantess in their peaceful community, nodded with satisfaction. I told you there was something fishy about that creature, but not everyone was convinced. Mr. Bailey, the blacksmith who had seen Tilda save the children, frowned. A father who comes to claim his daughter with lawyer's papers, that doesn't smell right. At the farm, Tilda watched the smoke rising from Willow Bend's chimneys from her attic window. She knew he was there. Somewhere in this town she had learned to love. The wind whistling through the tiles seemed to carry the echo of his voice, those honeyed tones she knew so well. Amos came up to join her, carrying 2 steaming cups of tea, a gesture of tenderness all the more precious now that they no longer had their ritual teapot. He's turning everyone against me, isn't he? She asked without turning around. Not everyone, Amos replied, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. And even if that were the case, we'd leave. We'd find another place. Tilda turned to him, surprised. You'd do that? Abandon your farm, your land? This land only makes sense if you're on it, he said simply. Before you, it was just dirt. Now it's a home. Outside, the wind picked up as if wanting to carry away their doubts and fears. But in the attic, huddled close, they drew strength from this new certainty. They wouldn't let themselves be separated again. It was when the tension seemed to be at its highest that an unexpected visitor appeared in Willow Bend. Marcus Webb, a former acrobat from Grayson's circus, stepped off the afternoon train with a worn canvas bag and ragged shoes. The cold February wind whipped his emaciated face, but his eyes retained the liveliness that characterized circus folk. He had heard about Tilda's story through the newspapers that had picked up the article about her heroic act. Thinner than before, marked by months of wandering, he still bore the scars of nights spent in the rain and the painful memories of their old gilded cage. I thought about going back to the circus after you left, he confessed to Tilda when he finally found her at the farm. But after seeing you save those children, I realized you were the only show truly worth seeing. And it didn't need a tent. Amos observed this man with natural wariness, but he quickly saw that Marcus looked at Tilda with respect, not with that covetousness he'd learned to dread in visitors. It was the look of a brother finding his sister. You need to know, Marcus continued, warming his hands around a teacup. Your father was never ruined by the fire. He had insurance, hidden accounts. He offered me money to testify against you, to say you'd stolen the cash box before leaving. Tilda stiffened. And what did you say? That I'd seen enough lies for a lifetime. The next day, when Silas Grayson organized his public hearing in the Willow Bend church demanding justice and restitution, Marcus was there. Sitting in the back, silent, he waited for his moment. Silas launched into his usual performance, pulling out crumpled papers, recounting his sacrifices as a devoted father, his sleepless nights worrying about his vanished daughter. The wind made the church rafters groan, as if protesting against so many falsehoods. This woman, he declared, pointing at Tilda, stole years of income from me. She owes me thousands of dollars. If this community truly intends to welcome her, it must bear her debts. It was then that Marcus stood up. Lie, he said simply, his voice carrying despite his thinness. Every word is a lie. Silence fell over the assembly. Silas blanched, recognizing his former employee. I worked for this man, Marcus continued, stepping forward towards the platform. "I saw how he treated his daughter, not as a person but as valuable livestock. I saw the accounts, the insurance, the money he extorted from visitors. And I also saw his daughter save him when a fire really broke out, not to claim a reward, but out of pure humanity." The wind outside seemed to approve, vibrating the stained glass windows and flooding the church with new light. Marcus's revelation had the effect of a bombshell in the Willow Bend church. Murmurs of indignation rose like a tide, carried by the wind gusting through the poorly closed doors. Silas Grayson, exposed, tried to regain control of the situation, brandishing his fake papers with increasing desperation. "This man is lying," he cried, his voice breaking. "He's jealous. He always wanted to destroy our family." But no one was listening anymore. Mr. Bailey the blacksmith had stood up, followed by several other men who had seen Tilda save the children. Sheriff Morrison, who had initially lent a sympathetic ear to Silas's accusations, now frowned as he examined the supposedly official documents more closely. Tilda rose in turn, and her imposing stature seemed to fill the entire church. For the first time facing her father, she didn't lower her eyes. The wind blowing outside seemed to hold its breath. "For 20 years, she said, her clear voice echoing under the arches, "you made me believe I was a burden, that my difference was a curse only your circus could turn into a blessing. You sold me as a monster so people would feel normal looking at me." Silas tried to interrupt her, but she continued, unperturbed. "But I am not a monster. I am not your property. I am not your source of income." She looked around at the faces listening intently. "I am Tilda Grayson, and I choose who I want to be." Amos stood up and joined Tilda. Without a word, he took her hand in his. Then Marcus did the same, placing himself on her other side. One by one, other residents stood. Mr. Bailey, the parents of the saved children, even some women who had initially rejected her. Silas found himself alone facing this human wall. His mask of the grieving father had finally slipped, revealing the greedy, manipulative man he had always been. "You can't," he stammered. "She owes me." "She owes you nothing," Amos cut in, his voice firm. "A daughter owes nothing to a father who treated her like merchandise." Sheriff Morrison approached Silas, his papers in hand. "These documents are fakes, Mr. Grayson, and from what I'm hearing, you could be charged with fraud and blackmail." Outside, the wind began to subside, as if the emotional storm that had shaken Willow Bend was finally coming to an end. Silas, understanding that his act had failed, gathered his belongings, muttering empty threats. "This isn't over," he called out as he left the church. "You still belong to me, Tilda." But his words were lost in the wind that carried them towards the hills, where lies die and truths are born. The weeks following Silas Grayson's forced departure were marked by an early spring that melted Willow Bend's last resistances. The wind, which had been the dramatic companion to their trials for so long, turned into a soft breeze carrying the scent of the first flowers and the promise of future harvests. Tilda and Amos worked side by side in their fields, preparing the sowing. Marcus had decided to stay, finding work with Mr. Bailey as a blacksmith's helper. His presence in the community served as a bridge between Tilda's painful past and her bright future. He sometimes told, with the typical humor of circus folk, anecdotes from their old life, but always to show its absurdity rather than nostalgia. One April morning, as Tilda watered her first vegetable plants, Amos appeared at the house door with something in his hands. He had spent weeks in his barn, working secretly on a mysterious project. What he held was a teapot, not identical to the old one, but fashioned by his own hands from tin he had melted and hammered with patience. "It's not perfect," he said, blushing slightly, "but it's ours. Just ours." Tilda took the teapot in her hands. It was rougher than the old one, marked by its creator's inexperience, but it shone with a special light. On the side, Amos had clumsily engraved two intertwined initials, T and A. "It's perfect," Tilda whispered, moved to tears. "Absolutely perfect." That evening, they drank their tea from the new teapot, sitting on the house steps watching the sunset paint the Montana hills orange and purple. The spring wind played in their hair, bringing with it the song of birds returning from their winter migration. "I have something to ask you," Amos said suddenly. setting down his cup nervously. He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a small silver ring, simple but strong, which he had forged himself from the remains of the old broken teapot. "Tilda Grayson," he said, kneeling before her, "will you be my wife? Not because you're extraordinary or different, but because you're you. And I can't imagine my life anymore without your laugh, without your strength, without your presence that transforms this farm into a home." The wind seemed to hold its breath, as if all of nature awaited her answer. Tilda looked at this man who offered her not just a marriage, but a complete transformation of her identity. From a sideshow attraction, she became a loved woman. From a burden, she became a treasure. "Yes," she said simply, and the wind resumed its course, carrying their happiness to the stars that began to light up the Montana sky. Tilda Grayson and Amos Klein's wedding took place on a May day where the wind seemed to have decided to join the celebration, gently caressing faces instead of whipping them. The Willow Bend Church, which had been the stage for so much tension just months before, was now filled with happiness. Tilda wore a dress she had sewn herself from a pearly white fabric, simple yet elegant, that highlighted her stature without caricaturing her. Amos, in his carefully brushed Sunday best, radiated a quiet happiness. Marcus, who had become their unofficial best man, had even managed to convince Mr. Bailey to lend him his least stained tie for the occasion. But what made this ceremony truly special was the spontaneous presence of almost the entire Willow Bend community. Even Mrs. Prescott, who had so long whispered against Tilda, had come, holding a bouquet of wildflowers picked from her own meadow. "I was wrong," she whispered to Tilda after the ceremony. "You're not just different, you're exceptional, and we're lucky to have you among us." Pastor Williams, who had initially hesitated to officiate this union, spoke words that resonated long in the hearts of the residents. "True love isn't measured by the size of bodies but by the greatness of souls." And today, two immense souls unite before us. After the ceremony, the reception took place in the churchyard, where tables had been set up under the great oak trees. Amos's new teapot, polished for the occasion, sat enthroned at the center of the head table, filled with fragrant tea that the newlyweds served to their guests. It was a symbolic gesture. This couple, who had learned to comfort each other, now shared that warmth with their entire community. Marcus spoke, raising his glass of lemonade. "I knew Tilda when she was a prisoner in her own body, exhibited as a curiosity. Today I see her free, loved, respected, and I learned that Amos was truly the man to see in her not a phenomenon, but an extraordinary woman." As the sun set and the evening breeze began to cool, the newlyweds retreated to their farm. On the way, Tilda stopped to look one last time at the village that had first rejected, then accepted, then adopted her. "Regret anything?" Amos asked, following her gaze. "On the contrary," she replied, squeezing his hand. "I thank the wind that brought me here. I thank the storm that destroyed the circus. I even thank my father, in a way." "Your father?" "Without him, I would never have learned to recognize true kindness when it appears. I would never have known how to appreciate a man who truly sees me." The evening wind enveloped their words like a blessing, and they returned home, towards their waiting teapot, and their life that was just beginning. A year later, Tilda and Amos Klein's farm had become a landmark across the county, not because it housed a woman extraordinary in size, but because it radiated a contagious happiness that drew visitors like flowers draw bees. The Montana wind, which had been the silent witness to their story, continued to blow through the hills, but it now carried echoes of children's laughter. For Tilda and Amos had opened their home to the county's orphans, to all those who, like her once, needed to learn that being different wasn't a curse. Marcus now ran his own forge with Mr. Bailey, and their metal creations, teapots, tools, jewelry, were renowned throughout the region. He had found his place in this community that had welcomed him like family. That spring morning, Tilda stood in her garden, watching the vegetables she and Amos had planted together grow. Her hands, once a symbol of her difference, now created life instead of being put on display. In the kitchen, the teapot Amos had fashioned for her warmed on the stove, ready for their morning ritual. "You see," she told little Sarah, an 8-year-old redhead helping her dig, "roots always grow downwards first in the darkness. But it's that hidden strength that allows flowers to reach for the light. Sarah looked up at her with big, curious eyes. Like you, Aunt Tilda? You grew up in the darkness before finding the light? Tilda smiled, stroking the child's hair. Exactly, honey. And so will you. Amos appeared on the threshold, the teapot in hand, his face lit up by that smile he reserved only for his wife. Tea's ready, he announced. And I have a surprise. He placed the teapot on the garden table they had set up under the great oak and pulled an official letter from his pocket. From the state of Montana, he said, his eyes shining. They want to appoint you as an official representative for the protection of disadvantaged children. Tilda took the letter, opened it, and read the words that confirmed what she had always hoped for without daring to admit it. She could transform her difference into a strength to serve others. Did this story touch you? Don't hesitate to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Like this video if it warmed your heart. And most importantly, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Your support allows us to continue sharing these stories of hope and transformation. The Montana wind caressed Tilda's face one last time, like an old friend saying goodbye. But it wasn't a farewell. It was a promise. The promise that sometimes when you have the courage to stay true to yourself despite the storms, life gives you exactly what your soul needs. A home, love, and the chance to turn your difference into a gift for the world. In this land where once there were only whispers, there was now respect. In this farm where silence reigned, voices and laughter now echoed. The woman who had fled the circus and the man who feared strength had built a home where dignity bloomed, and where no one was ever measured by their size, but always by their courage to stand tall.